Waging Peace, Global Adventures of a Lifelong Activist by David Hartsough with Joyce Holliday. Chapter 12, A Force for Peace, Creating a Nonviolent Army. In the 1990s, terrible violence broke out among many Serbs, Croats, and Muslims in Yugoslavia, fueled by the nationalist leaders of Serbia, Croatia, and Bosnia. The news of this tragedy overtaking what used to be known as the nation of Yugoslavia was heartbreaking to me. I couldn't fathom how people who had lived in harmony for so long, who had welcomed me so warmly into their hearts and homes, could be reduced to such barbarity and suffering. After the death of Yugoslavia's President Tito in 1980 and the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc a few years later, the United States no longer thought it necessary or important to support Yugoslavia as a bulwark against Russian communism. With US pressure, the World Bank demanded payback of loans. The Yugoslav government was forced to discontinue its broad economic and social benefits, which had created shared prosperity and security for the people of Yugoslavia. People began fighting over the crumbs. The era of scarcity created fertile ground for nationalist leaders to emerge in the various republics that were part of Yugoslavia, whipping up enmity and fanning the flames of ethnic strife. I agonized about the conflict and began strategizing with Kathy Kelly of Voices in the Wilderness, who was organizing an international nonviolent presence in Bosnia. During the summer of 1996, I spent 2 months in Bosnia-Herzegovina, Serbia, and Croatia with a Fellowship of Reconciliation peace delegation. We arrived just after the Serb militia's shelling of Sarajevo had ended, in the aftermath of the civil war that had devastated the region. We lived with families, getting to know the people and the situations they were enduring. The change from my visit as a college student was shocking. Still carrying with gratitude my warm memories of that unforgettable summer, I was stunned to witness the unspeakable horror that had overtaken this place, that had elicited such deep affection in me. Bosnia felt like one massive cemetery, with thousands of fresh graves everywhere. More than 250,000 people had been killed in the ethnic strife that had overwhelmed this once peaceful land. The horrific strategy of the Serb forces had included massive rape, torture, plunder, expulsion, and murder. In Srebrenica alone, they had massacred more than 8,300 Muslims and expelled another 25 to 30,000 a year before. Throughout the region, 4 million people had fled their homes, getting away from the violence which was being committed by all sides, and thousands of these homes had been destroyed. The economies of these now separate nations were in ruins, with few jobs available and travel very limited. The terror and tension of such a violent period will likely take generations to heal. I was heartened to see a few glimmers of hope amid the deep despair. A few brave souls were crossing the lines drawn between nations and hearts, opening themselves and their communities to the possibility of reconciliation and peace. The Gornji Vakuf Reconstruction Project, supported by the UN Development Program, the Austrian government, and several Quaker and other private groups, was bringing international volunteers from all over the world to rebuild this town on the front lines, which had been 80% destroyed during the war. The project had opened a women's center and a youth center where people from both sides of the conflict were able to meet one another and share their experiences. 16 men, 8 from each side, were learning carpentry and construction skills and were together rebuilding destroyed homes as they also rebuilt trust. In Mostar, which also had been terribly devastated during the conflict, I attended a powerful play put on by youth from both sides, a silent performance that portrayed the horror of their experiences during the war. In this city, where a historic 500-year-old bridge, or most, had been destroyed, young people from across Europe had developed a youth center called Mladi Most, or Young Bridge, where youth from both sides could gather, do photography, play sports, and rebuild a sense of community. In Sarajevo, I encountered a very courageous Serbian man named Božidar Sekulic. He was developing a citizens' alternative parliament to represent the people of all parts of Bosnia who were committed to creating a democratic, non-nationalistic, and peaceful future, rather than allowing their fate to be determined by the ruling nationalistic political parties. In Belgrade, I met the Women in Black, who had been bravely demonstrating every week for more than 4 years against the militarism and nationalism of the Serbian government. I spent time with very talented journalists who worked with WIN, Weekly Independent News. They were trying to start an independent television station in Serbia to counter the lies, propaganda, and nationalism of President Slobodan Milosevic's brutal regime. The cost of setting up the station and funding it for a year of operation was $3 million, a daunting sum, but less than the cost of one military tank, of which there were many hundreds in Serbia and Bosnia. I was grateful to meet and hear the inspiring stories of some of the more than 100,000 courageous young men who had left Serbia and gone underground rather than fight what they considered an unjust imperialistic war. And I was equally moved by the volunteers with Balkan peace teams. They were accompanying local peace and human rights activists throughout the former Yugoslavia, supporting their initiatives for democratic and multi-ethnic communities. When the peace delegation headed back home, I decided to stay and go on to Kosovo. I had heard that there was a strong nonviolent resistance movement there. Kosovo was a particularly painful place, but what I witnessed there was amazing and inspiring. Although 90% of Kosovo's population was Albanian by nationality, all political power and most economic power was held by the less than 10% who were Serbs. Many Albanians in Kosovo, known as Kosovars, described their society as worse than apartheid. They expressed their fear that Kosovo was a time bomb waiting to go off. The Albanian language had been outlawed in Kosovo. 80% of Kosovars who had worked in government, business, the media, and human services were fired in 1990 and remained unemployed. Schools, universities, and hospitals were closed to Kosovars, who were regular targets of gross human rights violations by the Serbs, including beatings, torture, and killings. But again, I had the privilege of seeing extraordinary signs of hope. The nonviolent movement in Kosovo had begun in 1989 with thousands of miners marching from the lead mines to Pristina, the capital, to protest their working conditions and exploitation. Hundreds went on a hunger strike for more than a week, almost a mile underground in temperatures that reached 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The Association of Independent Trade Unions called on Kosovars to participate in a general strike for half an hour every day, demanding a return to autonomy and respect for their rights as citizens. People lit candles in their windows at night as a symbol of their determination to be free, and jangled keys at demonstrations, chanting, "We hold the keys to unlock our prison." After a particularly violent response by Serb police, hundreds of thousands of Kosovars participated in creative Funeral for Violence, in which they carried a coffin labeled "Violence" to a cemetery and ritually buried it. While I was there, I got to know Adam Demaci, considered the Nelson Mandela of Kosovo. He had spent 28 years in prison for speaking out against the unjust treatment of the Albanian majority. An ardent proponent of nonviolent struggle for freedom and justice for the 2 million Kosovars, he served as president of the Council for the Defense of Human Rights in Kosovo. The Kosovar Albanians were establishing a complete alternative society. They formed a parallel government to represent their needs and a tax system to fund a university and alternative schools that operated out of private homes. Claiming the name of a famously compassionate native daughter, they set up a network of Mother Teresa medical centers where doctors and nurses donated their services. The Kosovars established farmers markets and launched several alternative periodicals to spread news and build their movement. The Serb crackdown was swift and brutal. Serb police officers raided the alternative clinics, seizing medicine, and arrested school teachers. Some Serb citizens and police stole food from the markets. Still, most Kosovars persisted in their nonviolent resistance and their support of one another through their alternative network. The post-pessimists were an energetic group of Albanian and Serbian youth who were meeting together to work toward a peaceful, just, and democratic future. The Kosovo Peace Group had a similar aim, creating dialogue between individuals from the two ethnic groups. But increasing pressure was being put on Serbs in both groups to end their association with Albanian Kosovars. From 1996 to 1998, I focused a lot of my energy on trying to bring the nonviolent movement in Kosovo to the attention of the world and drum up support for it. Kosovars from all sectors pleaded for international people to come and be present, to make it safer for them to escalate their nonviolent struggle. They asked for pressure to be put on the Serbian government to stop its repression of the majority population, just as international sanctions had successfully pressured the apartheid regime in South Africa. If there is not change soon, many told me, this situation will explode. Recognizing the extreme urgency, I traveled around Europe speaking and writing articles, and then did the same in the United States. I shared my experiences of Kosovo, the urgency and volatility of the situation, and the Kosovars' impassioned call for an international nonviolent presence. A lot of people looked perplexed and responded with, "Where is Kosovo?" It was an unfamiliar name and people were busy and preoccupied with other concerns. Kosovo simply wasn't a priority. I believe that the world passed up an extraordinary opportunity to support a bold and creative nonviolent movement and a peaceful resolution of that conflict. I was in Kosovo again in 1997. 70% of Kosovars were under 30 years old. On September 1st, 20,000 students who had to attend classes in living rooms, kitchens, garages, and mosques staged a march to the university that had once been open to everyone. They invited me to accompany them. All the students wore white shirts with flowers in their lapels. They marched quietly and peacefully toward the university they were banned from attending. About a mile down the road and still a great distance from their destination, they came to a line of Serbian police who were blocking their way. The marchers stopped and stood in total silence facing the armed police. It was the most disciplined, large, nonviolent action I have ever witnessed. After a tension-filled 10 minutes, the police burst into action, firing tear gas to disperse the marchers and riding their horses roughly into the crowd. The students ran in all directions, coughing, choking, trying to escape. Some were hurt and many were in shock from the effects of the tear gas and the violence of the police. Spirits were very heavy in the aftermath. I spent the following month strategizing with the students who were deeply committed to continuing their nonviolent struggle despite the assaults. I shared with them the history of nonviolent movements. I gave them books on nonviolence, including Gene Sharp's From Dictatorship to Democracy, and the Encyclopedia of Nonviolent Action, Protest, Power, and Change. I led nonviolence trainings, emphasizing the need to maintain a nonviolent discipline, even in the face of police repression. Every month, the students tried again to march to their former universities, only to face police roadblocks and brutality each time. After I left Kosovo, we kept in communication by email and continued our discussions about strategy. They invited me back in the spring of 1998. I recruited 4 young American students to go with me to support the courageous Kosovars in their nonviolent resistance struggle. The Serbian regime's reign of terror in Kosovo had escalated. In early March, Serbian police had killed 80 villagers in the Drenica region. We watched as more than 100,000 Kosovars, students, young families with babies, and older, feebler folks, some of whom were on crutches, marched in protest through the streets of Pristina. They were armed with nothing more than flowers, candles, and pictures of Mother Teresa against Serbian machine guns and riot gear. They ended their march at the Catholic Church with an interfaith memorial service for the victims. The next day, we accompanied 20,000 women who attempted to march the 30 miles from Pristina to Drenica, carrying loaves of bread to villagers who had fled their homes when the massacre took place. Serbian police turned them back and refused to allow any food or medicine to get through. Even personnel from the International Red Cross received death threats for trying to help the refugees. The American students and I led a nonviolence training with a group of about 800 people crowded into a large auditorium. The day after the training, all 5 of us were arrested under orders of President Milosevic. We were sentenced to 10 days in jail. The jail time was not a pleasant experience. The food was terrible and the cramped cells reeked of cigarette smoke. The weather outside was frigid and snowy and the prison had no heat. So we wore all the clothes we had just to keep from freezing. The prison authorities had shaved our heads. We had one hat between the 4 of us men, which we passed back and forth every hour or so, trying to share the warmth. The one woman in our group was in a different jail and fortunately got to keep her hair. We were extremely uncomfortable, but the Kosovars faced far worse punishment for their protests against the Serb repression. One of our group witnessed a man getting his hands smashed because he had asked permission to use the telephone. We saw evidence that our fellow inmates were being physically abused by our captors. 100,000 Kosovars demonstrating for justice every day for many weeks never made the international news, but 5 Americans in jail hit the front pages all around the world. We didn't realize when we were sitting behind bars how much attention we were getting, but apparently the Serbian authorities were uncomfortable with the publicity and decided to expel us from their country. They released us after 3 days and dumped us at the Macedonian border, stamping our passports with a warning that we were banned from returning for 10 years. After our release, we did what we could to try to put the real story into the press, alerting the world about the apartheid system in Kosovo. The Intergovernmental Kosovo Verification Mission eventually established a presence and began monitoring the situation and helping to limit the violence. But the nonviolent movement continued to be largely ignored by the world. In contrast, once some frustrated Kosovars decided that nonviolence wasn't getting them anywhere and formed the guerrilla Kosovo Liberation Front, the CIA and the US military stepped in to support their armed struggle. When the situation exploded, as many of us had predicted, President Clinton went on national television declaring that ethnic cleansing was taking place in Kosovo. He said essentially that the United States had 2 alternatives: to look the other way and do nothing, or to go in and start bombing. The Kosovo verification mission was withdrawn and the bombs began dropping on March 24th, 1999. This was dubbed Humanitarian Intervention, which those of us who had worked with the nonviolent and movement in Kosovo totally rejected. Bombing, from our perspective, can never be considered humanitarian. Those of us who had been in Kosovo knew that there was a third alternative: to support the nonviolent movement there with our bodies and our resources. At the time of Clinton's statement and the launching of the NATO, North American Treaty Organization, bombing campaigns, I was in The Hague in the Netherlands, with 9,000 other peace activists from all over the world, a century after the first Hague appeal for peace, we had come together from 130 different nations to explore how we could put an end to war. I was leading a 5-hour workshop every day on the situation in Kosovo. One afternoon, during a panel discussion, I laid out my vision for an international nonviolent peace army. Standing against the back wall of the packed room, listening in stunned amazement, was Mel Duncan, an organizer from St. Paul, Minnesota. Mel had arrived at the conference hoping to drum up support for the same idea, which had come to him during a retreat at Plum Village, the meditation center founded in southern France by Vietnamese Buddhist monk and peace activist Thich Nhat Hanh. Mel was feeling rather overwhelmed by the crowd at the conference, twice what had been expected. Every venue was jammed. He had called his wife, Georgia, the day before and told her, "I can't organize here. I could stand on a chair, and even if I shouted, I'd get lost in the background noise." She very wisely counseled, "Well then, be quiet and listen." Mel followed her advice and showed up at the panel discussion the next day. When it was over, he pushed his way through the crowd toward me. He told me that if I was serious about what I had said, he was ready to sign up and collaborate to formulate a plan. Thus was hatched the Nonviolent Peace Force. It was not a new idea. Before Mahatma Gandhi's assassination in 1948, he was building a Shanti Sena, or peace army. We were also inspired by the work of Christian peacemaker teams, Voices in the Wilderness, Balkan peace teams, and other groups that have been involved for years in similar work. My experiences with Peace Brigades International in Guatemala, Witness for Peace in Nicaragua, the ecumenical delegation to the Philippines and elsewhere had convinced me of the protective power of peaceful presence. We hope through the Nonviolent Peace Force to send peacekeepers into conflict situations by the hundreds instead of by the handfuls, and hopefully help the world learn that there is a better alternative than violence and armed intervention. The struggle in Kosovo had given birth to this vision that I had been pondering for quite some time. That dire situation provided strong motivation to get the Nonviolent Peace Force off the ground. I remain convinced that had the international community rallied around the nonviolent movement there, a peaceful resolution could have been reached and a costly military conflict averted, costly in the loss of lives, in the billions of dollars expended, and in the escalated ethnic hatred and mistrust that will be the legacy of Kosovo for years to come. The NATO bombing of Kosovo and Serbia continued for 3 months with many civilian casualties, causing Serbs to rally more fervently around their dictator. Serb security forces eventually withdrew from Kosovo, but Milosevic remained in power. Although the International Court of Justice in The Hague indicted him for genocide and crimes against humanity, his stranglehold grip on what was left of the former Yugoslavia held for many months. What NATO firepower couldn't accomplish, a determined group of 12 nonviolent student activists eventually did. They launched the youth movement Otpor, resistance. Organizing marches aimed at overthrowing Milosevic, they grew a movement that eventually included more than 70,000 supporters. Almost 2,000 were arrested in a massive crackdown, many of them beaten in police custody. The symbol of their movement, a clenched fist, appeared all over the former Yugoslavia, stenciled by the intrepid and persistent students. Otpor was credited with playing a key role in the overthrow of Milosevic on October 5th, 2000. The fallen dictator ultimately surrendered to security forces on March 31st, 2001, after an armed standoff at his fortified villa in Belgrade, and he died in a jail cell in The Hague 5 years later. But in March 1999, Kosovo was still embroiled in violence and very much on our minds at the Hague Peace Conference. Mel Duncan and I shared our hope with everyone who would listen, and several attendees committed themselves to working with us toward building a global nonviolent peace force. Those of us who were part of its founding wanted to create a trained nonviolent army that would respond to invitations from local peacemakers in areas of violence and war around the globe. This corps of trained civilians would be available to accompany threatened activists and communities, protect human rights, work with local groups to prevent violence, summon the attention of the international community for peaceful intervention, and create space for peaceful resolution of conflicts. We hope to have our first group non-combat ready by 2003. We were aiming for an initial contingent of 200 active participants, 400 reservists, and 500 supporters of an emergency response network, committed to receive urgent action alerts and send emails, make phone calls, and urge the press to turn the spotlight on specific conflicts. We wanted to be international eyes, ears, and conscience. Our mission was to help save the lives of people being targeted because of their work for justice and peace, and to protect civilian communities that so often bear the brunt of violence in war zones. We hoped that never again would the world ignore those who are struggling for justice nonviolently. I spent the next couple years searching out individuals and organizations that resonated with the idea of a nonviolent peace force. I met with peacemakers and human rights workers around the United States and in various parts of Asia: India, Japan, Indonesia, the Philippines, Thailand, Cambodia, and South Korea; Europe, Germany, Sweden, Great Britain, the Netherlands, Italy, Belgium, and Switzerland; and Latin America: Brazil, Argentina, Venezuela, Ecuador, Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Costa Rica. Fortunately, Servicio Paz y Justicia was convening an international gathering in Uruguay. So Phil McManus, who accompanied me, and I got to meet activists from all over Latin America. In Montevideo, Uruguay, a colleague, David Grant, traveled throughout Africa and the Middle East. We built on groundwork that had been laid in May 1995, when a couple dozen of these peace practitioners had converged for a meeting in Sweden. Their aim was to develop a framework for communication and support. This was a critical step toward making concrete the global peace force, an idea that had surfaced many times through the years. We learned a great deal during our exploratory visits. First, we learned that creative and courageous peacemakers and human rights defenders are working in the most violent places in the world, and more often than not, this work is being led by women. Second, we learned that no one can make peace for someone else. Peacemaking is the job of local people. But specially trained internationals can support these efforts and provide much needed nonviolent protection, undermining isolation and bringing the world's attention to such local efforts. As we traveled, we asked two questions. First, if there was a global nonviolent peace force, would this be helpful to your part of the world and to your work? And second, would you like to work with others to help create the nonviolent peace force? The answers were overwhelmingly yes, yes. We secured more than 300 individual endorsements, including from 8 Nobel Peace laureates. We researched more deeply many of these efforts and produced a 300-page feasibility study covering what had worked, what hadn't worked, and what hadn't yet been tried. We wanted to build on previous successes and expand the effort to a scale that we hoped would get the attention of governments, the United Nations, and people around the world interested in an alternative to armed intervention and in helping to end war. By this time, we had received informal invitations from 10 conflict areas: Sri Lanka, Palestine, Israel, Burma, Tibet, Korea, the Philippines, Guatemala, Colombia, Zimbabwe, and Nigeria. An interim steering committee analyzed each invitation based on criteria developed from the feasibility study. We narrowed the applicants to 3. We then sent exploratory teams to each of those areas: Guatemala, Palestine, Israel, and Sri Lanka. In December 2002, we brought together 130 activists from 47 countries and 70 peacemaking organizations for our founding conference outside Delhi, India. There, we officially launched the Nonviolent Peace Force and created an international steering committee as the governing body. The exploratory teams brought their reports to the convening event in India, where delegates discussed, debated, and then chose Sri Lanka as the site of our pilot project. The Nonviolent Peace Force, NP, was launched in April 2003 with an 11-member team in Sri Lanka, a small, lush island. The civil war between the Sri Lankan military and the Tamil Tigers, who were fighting for an independent state for the Tamil minority, had claimed 65,000 lives. Assassinations and disappearances of those working for change were common. In the 1990s, Vadagama Samitha, a Buddhist monk and member of Sri Lanka's parliament, had received death threats because he had hidden young Tamil men being pursued by the government. Members of Peace Brigades International accompanied him whenever he had to travel to the capital city of Colombo. They really safeguarded my life during that dark period of our history, Samitha said. They saved my life. I would say I warmly welcome the Nonviolent Peace Force because we need international peace activists to help defuse our situation. Though we had been warned by people from the UN and other international agencies to stay out of the area because it was too dangerous, we went to Vaikari, a small town where armed confrontation seemed inevitable. Together with local community leaders, we negotiated so that civilians could take shelter in the town's school and church if fighting broke out. On Good Friday, the armed conflict erupted, and thousands of people had to flee their homes. They found sanctuary in that school and church. Our second deployment was to the Philippines in 2007. Before the arrival of the Nonviolent Peace Force, the Philippine government sometimes responded to threats or rumors of threats from the Muslim community in Mindanao with violence. People in Mindanao had been found decapitated and local communities had been bombed. The tension threatened to escalate into all-out war, and 100,000 people were preparing to flee their homes. The Nonviolent Peace Force was invited in by both sides of the conflict. I met with the vice president of the Philippine government and the vice chair of the guerrilla Moro Islamic Liberation Front, MILF. Both of them wanted to keep the violence from escalating out of control and work toward a negotiated political settlement of their long-standing differences. The Nonviolent Peace Force team in Mindanao, which continues its work, has been able to check rumors, get accurate information to both sides, and deter violence. Its presence has enabled civilians caught in the middle to remain in their homes. Serving as a liaison between communities, government officials, and humanitarian service providers, the Nonviolent Peace Force works with local partners to provide safety and security for non-combatants and to strengthen human rights monitoring. In partnership with UNICEF, Nonviolent Peace Force launched a program in the Philippines regarding the rights and safety of children. In December 2009, both the Philippine government and the MILF invited the Nonviolent Peace Force to serve on the UN's international monitoring team for a ceasefire brokered by the Malaysians, specifically to monitor civilian protection. Nonviolent Peace Force continues in this role with 9 teams deployed around the country, making daily reports to the major parties to the conflict and helping to hold the peace. Nonviolent Peace Force was invited to Southern Sudan in 2009 to help prevent violence, protect civilians, and promote stability in the period leading up to the referendum for independence in January 2011. Nonviolent Peace Force unarmed civilian peacekeeping teams have continued in the new nation of South Sudan, helping to stabilize that very fragile new country. They've offered protection in local conflicts, for example, responding to tribal violence through relationship building, regular travel between communities, and providing protective accompaniment. Nonviolent Peace Force's work in the Yida refugee camp involves communicating and cooperating with international humanitarian agencies such as the UNHCR, the United Nations Human Rights Commission, and non-state armed actors to protect the civilian population, prevent gender-based violence, increase safety and security, and develop protection trainings. Currently, Nonviolent Peace Force lives and works in several internally displaced people, IDP, camps, identifying and mitigating protection concerns for the IDPs, the internally displaced people camps, working closely and delicately with women and children, young men and chiefs, civilians, and potential combatants. Women's security teams have been formed in several locations, allowing IDP women's voices and concerns to be heard and acted upon for the first time. We now have Nonviolent Peace Force support groups in 40 countries. We estimated that it would cost $1.7 million to sustain the Nonviolent Peace Force for the first year. That seemed staggeringly daunting when we began, but we reminded ourselves that that amount is less than the US military spends every 2 minutes. We have received donations from several religious organizations and grants from a few foundations. Individual contributions have ranged from a pledge of 6 cents to a check for $40,000 from a teacher who cashed in his entire retirement fund to support us. The Hartsough Duncan Founders Circle, created by friends to honor Mel and me, has raised several $1 million. Our commitment is to pay our workers rather than expect them to be volunteers. That enables people of all classes and from economically marginal parts of the world to participate. The policy of paying peacekeepers has been particularly critical for team members from Africa and Asia, where a Nonviolent Peace Force worker remains a breadwinner with a reliable source of income and can continue to support a family. While in country, Nonviolent Peace Force workers live as the people around them do, very simply. They can choose to send their pay back to their families, have it deposited in a bank account, or receive it at the end of their 2-year term of service. One worker from Kenya was able to build a home for his family when he returned with his earnings. A paid income enables Nonviolent Peace Force peacekeepers to remain for multiple years, with some now serving for more than 6 years and other veterans returning after a respite. Most Nonviolent Peace Force workers stay in the same place for an entire 2-year term, but some move around. A Pakistani who served in Sri Lanka now leads the work in Mindanao, and 3 of Nonviolent Peace Force's local staff from Sri Lanka offer leadership in South Sudan. The criteria and training are rigorous. We require participants to have exhibited a clear commitment to nonviolence. We expect them to have had some cross-cultural experience so that they will not be scared off by dire poverty or extreme violence. We conduct a 4-week training in how to be an effective peace team member, and in addition, we provide language training if needed. Early in the effort, we had talked with some people at the United Nations about the Peace Force. Many of them told us they thought it was a great idea. One added this qualifier: show us it can work for 8 to 10 years, and we'll get behind it and take it on. Increasingly, UN agencies are paying attention and supporting our work. Rolf Carrière, a Dutchman with whom we connected in South Africa at the Parliament of World Religions, is a retired country director with UNICEF who served in many Asian nations. He has been opening many doors for the Nonviolent Peace Force. Through his influence, UNICEF has been very supportive of our work, especially in protecting children. Nonviolent Peace Force currently has 8 contracts with 5 UN agencies. Nonviolent Peace Force's participation in the international monitoring effort for the ceasefire in the Philippines led very significantly to our conducting a nonviolence training at the academy where the United Nations trains its diplomats. In 2012, high-level briefings on unarmed civilian peacekeeping were held at the UN in New York and Geneva. Even some friendly governments are paying attention now. Nonviolent Peace Force recently received a grant of 5 million euros from the European Union to expand our work in the Philippines, and an additional €1 million from the Belgian government to extend Nonviolent Peace Force's work into additional communities in South Sudan. The Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, Spain, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and France have also contributed generously. Nonviolent Peace Force has a policy of accepting no more than 10% of its budget from the US government. No problem there. The Nonviolent Peace Force has only received minimal funding from the US Institute of Peace for the feasibility study at the beginning. The work has expanded so that the Nonviolent Peace Force's annual costs are now about $8 million. This figure is even more daunting than the one with which we began, but it is still less than what the world's nations collectively spend on war and military endeavors every 4 minutes. I consider the people I've met around the world who have had key roles in launching and sustaining the Nonviolent Peace Force part of my community and my family. We are bound together in an exciting project. From the beginning, we've been committed to having both our governing board and our peace teams composed of members that are half from the global south and half from the north. We did not want this effort to be a US dominated or controlled. And Mel Duncan and I set out early to work ourselves out of our jobs. I do best launching new efforts, and I don't enjoy or excel at administration. So I was happy to step back after a few years and focus my time and energy again on peace workers, which we consider the midwife of the Nonviolent Peace Force. The work of the Nonviolent Peace Force continues. As I write this, the Nonviolent Peace Force has been invited to send peace teams to Burma and has found the funding to support them. I'm heartened by the words of anthropologist and UN messenger of peace, Jane Goodall, about our effort. Quote, I carry a photo of the Nonviolent Peace Force team of brave men and women in my briefcase to remind myself that however terrible things seem, there is a powerful source for good in a world gone mad. In the end, the indomitable human spirit will prevail.